And we are live here in the spoiler room. It's our second spoiler room of 2023. So glad folks can join us. Thank you for coming down the stairs, pulling up a chair, and popping your favorite drink with us as we talk train movies this month. It's e-ticket month here. And last week, we kicked it off with a look at Murder on the Orient Express, 1974, not Kenneth Branagh's mustache one with Parkour Perot. And today, I decided to set the Wayback Machine to 1938 and look at a film called The Lady Vanishes. And with me tonight is our wonderful crew member, right-hand man, and as I always say, the man who just keeps coming back for more. It's none other than Mr. Ian Simmons. Hello, Ian. How are you, sir?
I'm great. I'm excited to talk about a movie that I finished watching this morning, this evening, and I ordered the Criterion Blu-ray of it, partially because it was half
Wow.
off, but partially because I am in love with this movie.
Well, that's great to hear because guess what? You get to do the synopsis of this movie.
One of these days, I'm going to toss it back to you, Mark. Or let's just bring on a guest, a third guest, just to do the synopsis, and then they can be dismissed.
They can leave. They're just like, thanks for coming. Appreciate that.
I don't quite know how to synopsize this movie. I'll give the broad strokes. I'm going to get these details wrong right off the bat because I had to watch this thing in roughly 4 parts throughout my day. But there is a train that is traveling somewhere like across Europe to a destination. There's a young woman on the train, and her name is Iris Matilda Henderson. She's on the way to meet her fiance. She's led a life of, I guess, adventure and fun, being a swinging single, and it's time to settle down and marry a man she doesn't love. Right before she gets in the train, she is a brick or something falls on her head from a third-story window, and she gets concussed. And on the train, she passes out. And when she wakes up, the elderly lady, Mrs. Madame Froy, who she met at the train station or the hotel the night before, is taking care of her, and they're hanging out. They're swapping stories and all that business. Iris falls asleep or passes out again, and when she wakes up, no one on the train seems to know anything about Madame Froy because the lady has vanished, as the title suggests. And it becomes this, not exactly a whodunit, but a where is she? Iris is convinced that Madame Froy is not a figment of her imagination, that she's on the train, and that everybody on the train that she talks to is sort of lying or gaslighting her for whatever reason. And it turns out there's this giant, crazy conspiracy afoot. She teams up with Gilbert, played by Michael Redgrave, who is a clarinetist that she kind of has a meet cute, but it's like the rom-com. They hate each other, but they end up loving each other thing. Sorry, I forgot to mention that Margaret Lockwood plays Iris. And Mae Whitty plays Miss Froy. So it's a weird film. One of the strangest things I've ever seen. And I did not realize this because I'm not fully up on the man's filmography. But when the words directed by Alfred Hitchcock popped up on the screen, I was like, oh, this is like a crazy murder suspense movie. And then I watched the first 15 minutes of it. I'm like, oh, this is a strange comedy. And then a half hour into it, I was like, oh, this is a strange comedy mixed with crazy tension, but there's not like the score to like accentuate. You can see the moments where in a later Hitchcock film there would have been a sting on the score, like when you see Froy, because Madame Froy had written her name sort of in condensation on the glass, and later that kind of comes back into importance, and it's like, dun! But no, it's just like the whole thing takes some crazy twists and turns, but it never loses the suspense, and it never loses its sense of humor about itself. I can't think of another movie like this that I've seen, and I wonder, why have people been wasting their time remaking and adoring Murder on the Orient Express when the real money is with The Lady Vanishes?
Yeah, this was a new one for me to watch in a blind spot, or early Hitchcock is a blind spot for me, only because I'm such a Psycho fan that's what I watch, you know? It's like, I don't watch it, I need to watch any other Hitchcock, I'll
Yeah, you gotta
watch
watch
this.
Vertigo. You gotta watch
But well,
Vertigo.
I've watched Vertigo. Okay,
Okay.
when we did our 8 weeks of Hitchcock, that's part of the reason why I did that. I watched some other films, and I was just like, "This is amazing. Look, there's that filmmaker, there's that filmmaker. Look at how many people have borrowed from Hitchcock."
Borrowed is
But
being very generous.
borrowed is very generous. Well, what's interesting with Hitchcock, though, is for as much as we revere him today, his early stuff was not all well received. This, in fact, I think was one of his first actual hits.
I was looking, it all started with looking at the specs on that Criterion Blu-ray, because I
Mhm.
guess there's a special, like a feature on there about the mega producer David O. Selznick,
Sure.
who and I was then I that drove me to Wikipedia. And apparently Hitchcock's first 3 films were failures, but
Mhm.
Selznick saw something in this guy and is like, I'm gonna give him a chance, like another chance to prove himself. And this like kicked off his career. This movie was a big success.
Mhm.
And it's what's nuts to think about is that the year after this movie, Selznick produced another film, uh, Gone with the Wind, which
Yeah,
which
right?
which I saw last week for the first time, and which also features an impossibly talented, and I'll say it, hot lead actress. I
Mhm.
mean, and here's the thing, like, Margaret Lockwood, I looked up her age. She was 21 or 22 when she made this.
Yes.
But she's got that kind of 1930s, 1940s lead actress quality where
Mhm.
she doesn't look like she's 22, but she doesn't look older. She's just got this nebulous age to her, but I was like, "She's 22." There's no way that 22-year-olds nowadays carry themselves to the degree that she does in this movie.
Yeah, the way she carries herself, conducts herself, acts, I mean, you know, watching this, I was like, yeah, when it first started out, I'm like, "Oh, this is just quirky," and I'm just smiling, and my wife is getting a kick out of my reactions. I'm going, "This is Hitchcock." I mean, this is like, you know, and you can see the inklings. You know, when I knew what I was in for, like, right away because it's 38, and they opened with a wonderful miniature town and train, and there's even a cargo. I It pulled me in right there because I'm just like, "Oh, this is quaint. This is just a quaint opening."
They've got, like, 3 people standing in the snow down there, and you're just, like, hoping that one of them will actually move.
I looked at it for a moment, I go, "Did they blend it or something?" Because I watched it, and no, they didn't move, and then they get into town and like, "Okay, we're gonna go into town, and we're gonna get," and then you get this car driving down the road, but it's not quite smooth, so it's kinda like it, like, gets stuck in a little bit, it's like, "Doot, doot, doot, doot," and I'm like, "That's just quaint." I found it adorable, and then later on, you get more train miniatures as well, before you got, actual train footage.
Yeah, I'll say honestly, that first 15 minutes or however long it is that they're at the hotel before everyone
Right.
boards the train the next day, I was not charmed by that at all. And I
Sure.
think I need to watch this movie again. That's one of the other reasons I bought
Mhm.
it because I want to watch it with my wife. And I think it'll be a weirdly easy sell because she doesn't like watching horror movies anymore.
Oh, sure.
But I feel like I can say this is a Hitchcock murder mystery, sort of, or it's a mystery,
Mystery, yeah.
but it's one that A, has a happy ending, but B, is just so kind of, like, delightful and strange throughout that it's not gonna give you nightmares in any fashion. But I was like, I didn't understand it. I thought, "Okay," my brain was working overtime. I was thinking, "Okay, maybe this was early Hitchcock and he tried comedy and he was terrible at it, so he decided to make suspense films," because, again, I gotta watch it again because I was, like, not
Mhm.
quite in the right frame of mind because I was so shocked. It's like watching, Michael Bay trying to direct The Golden Girls or something. It just doesn't work. But yeah, on balance, when he introduces those suspense elements and the whole like gaslighting and Mrs. Froy,
Mhm.
Madame Froy, like this, it totally works.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it starts off a little bumpy, but what I appreciate with the opening is, one, yeah, it's weird seeing Hitchcock handle comedy, like actual like full on like zany Marx Brothers type crazy hotel comedy, which is what this first starts off as, where you've got all this, it was a great way. It was an interesting early way to introduce characters because I mean, you get this formula that's not as zany, but we got it with the, Murder on the Orient Express and pretty much any murder mystery type thing. You get that introduction of all the characters who you're going to see throughout this film that end up playing either minor or major roles. We're introduced to that, the British guys who keep wanting to see their cricket match. You've got as we mentioned, Ms. Henderson, who's going to get married, and she's got her two friends who have traveled Europe with her, and she's very well off. She's from money. You get introduced to the clarinetist who's writing a book on folk dances.
And it's taking him like 4
4
years to
years.
write. Like, well, it's a big book. And also, like, here's a question. Maybe you know this,
Yeah.
because your wife is a big fan of Murder on the Orient Express.
Mm.
Do you know when Agatha Christie wrote that novel?
No, I didn't ask her, but I know it was an older novel, but, um
I ask because there are actually three passengers on this train that reminded me exactly of the movie we talked about last week. There's like this old widow type character in the giant black dress with the kind of headpiece to it. And then there's also the couple that are having an affair, and they're both trying to figure out like ways to leave their partners, like
Mhm.
Sean Connery and Vanessa Redgrave. So I'm wondering, like, I don't think Agatha Christie ripped this off, but perhaps because I know this movie was also based on a book, so they're like rival books. I feel like there's a whole weird backstory to this that I just don't know.
Well, Murder on the Orient Express was written in 1934 and made its debut in February of 1934, and the film was 38. So they very well could be, we're not doing Murder on the Orient Express, but we're doing Murder on the Orient Express. But it's not murder. She just vanishes. Hi. Uh,
Well, I think that is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons I give this film the edge on that is that we don't have the world class. We don't have like the Belgian Sherlock Holmes on this
right.
train. We've got, one of the potential victims of this plot trying to figure it out along with
Mhm.
someone that she relies on but has just met and doesn't quite trust.
Right.
Um, it's a great setup.
And you mentioned the hotel scene. One of the things is, even if you don't quite care for Alfred Hitchcock's comedic directing, um, the camera work in it is definitely Hitchcock, though. They do things in here that, you was not necessarily seen by a lot of people. A lot of wonderful uh trucking shots. Like there's this one shot in the lobby when everybody's got to stay at the hotel and there's only a limited amount, and the camera actually moves through the crowd, panning across the crowd over to a phone. But it's like you don't see a lot of that in earlier films, but that's Hitchcock for you, doing different things with the camera.
And I think that was one of the things that kind of annoyed me was like I recognized some of his signatures in
Right.
that opening part. I'm like, why are you wasting this on this dumb comedy? But I don't think that
But
anymore, like after
no,
having watched the whole thing.
once you watch the whole thing and see how the characters play out and you learn more about the characters, yeah, but initially it starts off kind of a Marx Brothers-ish, like one level, like just below a Marx Brothers zany hotel comedy is what you got going on with all these characters. But then you get the wonderful Mrs. Froy, who is just, she was at this point she was credited because she was Dame May Whitty at this point in this film. She was a dame, dame, which is a very prestigious designation in England, and you instantly just love her character.
She's great, and it's also, you know, before you have any inkling of how she plays into this whole thing, you figure, okay, she's going to be a victim. or
Mhm.
if she is part of whatever like nefarious plot is afoot, she's very good because
Yeah.
you want to believe that she's just this sweet old lady who bears a strange resemblance to Lon Chaney Jr. Almost like if Lon Chaney Jr. played Mrs. Doubtfire, it would be Madame Froy.
Eh,
Hello.
hello, yes. But she's just an endearing character. You wouldn't expect, and we'll get to it a little bit later, but you wouldn't suspect her who she is. There's a bit of mystery of, well, why would this woman disappear? And when Henderson gets the brick on her head, it's fully intended for Mrs. Froy for whatever reason we don't know, but you could tell that it's actually intended for Froy. Um, because it's the old Hitchcock of showing the audience what's going to happen before the characters know what's going to happen.
Well, on top of that, there's a guy earlier on in the film
Mhm.
that is he singing, I think, and that's
Yeah,
when the
he's singing
hands come
outside,
into
and
frame,
yeah.
right? And the hands come in from off screen and strangle him.
Mhm.
That it was such a strange thing because there was no suspense to it. It looked like I don't know if it's just because it was the flat like angle to it or whatever, but
Mm.
I was just puzzled. I'm like, is this supposed to be scary? Because it's not. It's weird, but it's not scary.
No, but there is a bit of humor because he gets choked. Mrs. Froy thinks he's just done singing for the day, and she actually tosses a coin down to the street for him. You
Yeah.
Yeah, the killing of the singer, I'm not quite sure on, but I think it was just kind of to throw you off maybe a little bit, and just that there's some kind of danger lurking around Mrs. Froy, setting that up. So, adding the seeds of suspicion that Henderson doesn't quite have, but giving the audience that little extra role of, well, what's going on? Why are these things happening to Mrs. Fry? She's just such a wonderful, enduring, here, would you like teas and crumpets type of lady. Like literally, like, she's like someone's grandma, for crying out loud. And
Yeah, and
then
it's nice to see like the little details that Iris picks up on that helps to
Mhm.
convince first Gilbert and then other people that this person really has disappeared, even though she's not believed at first. Like there's the special brand of tea that they
Right.
share. It was like was it something like 1 million Mexicans love this tea. I'm
Yeah.
like, what? Okay.
Yeah, the tea, and it says 1 million Mexicans. Uh, and I love how that plays in later when Gilbert Redman, played by Michael Redgrave, go figure, they put Redmond, Redgrave, you know, but how later on he drops a hint that he actually believes her when he's like, 1 million Mexicans, I don't see them around.
Yeah. But it was such a
here.
nice, you know, way to clue us in or to help bring his character around to believing Iris. He just
Right.
happens to be in the hallway when the chef, the cook from the train comes to empty out like the slop. And he just throws it out the window. I always wondered how they did that back then. It was like, yeah, just throw it out into the countryside. And then the label from the special brand of tea flops onto the train window because of the wind and it
Mhm.
sticks there because of the grease. He's like, "Oh, I believe she was telling the truth."
Oh, I believe she's telling, yeah. Well, this was, Redgrave's first feature film. I mean, he had a
Really?
yeah, this is his first feature starring role. He was in a minor role in a film previous to this, but this is Michael Redgrave's debut feature film.
What
So,
else do you know what else he was in? Because I
I
don't know that I'm familiar with his
well,
work. I thought he was amazing.
no, he did a lot. He did a lot of British. Go figure. A lot of British movies and such. We're talking the old studio system, even in Britain. But he would star in actually a 19. Everybody remembers the 1984 movie, and the one made with what's his name? I forgot now. But it's actually, there was another feature version of 1984 in 1956, and he starred in that. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. I was
Wow.
surprised myself because I was looking up his filmography, and like I said, he did a lot of he did a lot of British TV shows and movies for them. He was in, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, The Battle for Britain. He's been in a lot of that, circle. He didn't do a lot of like Hollywood produced stuff, but he did a lot of yeah, he just like launched his career though, because this film was so popular that it really put him on the map, and actually helped it helped Lockhart as well, because this film took Lockwood, excuse me, because this launched her career a bit, and then she took a role later on that ended up making her the iconic femme fatale, because that's what she played then later on. But yeah, this film did for a lot of people, not just Hitchcock. It it was a big hit. Oh
Well, I mean, the thing about Redgrave,
yeah.
and this is the second week in a row we've talked about a mystery on a train involving an actor with the last name Redgrave. What have you done, Mark?
It's just a coincidence. In all honesty, I just look at these films and go, I want to talk about that one, and they end up having that kind of connection. So,
It's
uh,
spooky. It's
it is,
very
it is,
spooky.
it's
But
scary.
no, what I liked about him is he reminded me of Clark Gable's character in Gone with the Wind.
Oh,
You know,
sure. Hmm.
although Gilbert Redmond an actual good person, but he, unlike Rhett Butler, but he
Fred
has that.
Pepper, yeah.
Right, he's got that same kind of, like, roguish charm, like, every
Hmm.
line is some kinda like a deprecating one-liner, but he really does kind of man up and become the hero, and at the end of the movie, when, it's the train gets to the destination, and they're about to part ways because Iris is like, 'cause I had totally forgotten by the end of this crazy mystery and adventure that Iris was going off to get married.
Married, yeah,
And when they're in that one compartment or whatever, he's like, "Well, I guess this is it. I hope you have a happy life," or something, or he was like, "So what's
yeah,
next?" And she's like, "Oh, I gotta go marry Christopher," or whatever the hell his name was.
yeah.
He looked genuinely hurt. And it's like I honestly I almost said out loud watching this on my laptop, "Aw."
You do feel bad, but luckily, she's like, she doesn't want to be with the rich guy anyway. She chooses the vagabond writer, which, who knows? Maybe he goes on to writing a very popular book. Uh but yeah, I like the chemistry between these two characters. I do like too the character of Iris Henderson. She's interesting because she's not, for lack of a better term, flighty or dim-witted or anything of that
No.
nature at all, that you might picture for a character like she is actually a very strong woman of the time. She's getting married because, as she put it, she's done everything else, and so she feels like it's kind of her obligation to her family more than anything. You feel that she's going to get married. She's doing this kind of out of duty, but she still could stand on her own easily. They established that fairly quick. Um, and yeah, this ends up becoming a mashup of Gaslight and uh, and Murder on the Orient Express. In all honesty, when she wakes up and starts doing the mystery, the vagabond, he decides to help her to be the gentleman, because he may be a recluse or whatnot, but he's still a gentleman, and he wants to You feel like he legitimately wants to help her. He's not just helping her to like get in good with her. You feel like he genuinely wants to help a person. Like he's not a total bastard, basically.
Right, and also that, it starts off as sort of self-interest, but then
Yeah,
you get the feeling that he just wants to know what the hell's going on. And
right.
then eventually as they both get deeper into it, then it becomes, oh, this isn't just a fascination. This is now
Mhm.
life and death for both of us. And then pretty soon it's life and death for all the people on the train who are not involved in the conspiracy. And they end up in this. I mean, it's weird because this is 1938.
Yeah.
So, this film was probably made in like 37, and I'm not sure what the context of the novel was, but it's all very vague. Like
Mhm.
if this movie had come out a few years later, it would have been, oh, Mrs. Froy is trying to get these secret coded messages to Britain to stop the Nazis. But as it stands, like when uh, Gilbert finally gets it out of her, like what she's doing, she's like, "Oh, I've got to deliver this coded message to England to keep two European powers from blowing things up." I'm like, that's very generic.
Yeah, they do keep it vague. I think it's on purpose because this being made in 38, things were sensitive. And if this film got distributed across, it's one of those time periods where people, even back in those times, were sensitive and they didn't want to start a war over a movie.
Right, but it's almost like, because you've got like the bad guys, there's some like English folks, there's some French people, there's some people who wear conspicuously German style, outfits, but you could have just called it Hydra and be done with it, but they never really specify like which organizations are in this evil team, which is kind of charming itself.
It is charming. I like that it is, but it isn't. It what they are referring to, but they're being vague about it on purpose for, like I said, for when it was made. Because it even takes place in a fictional country. Most of the train ride is in this town called Mandrika, which doesn't exist in Europe at any time on any map, but it's Mandrika is where most of this takes place. And yeah, the bad guys who are chasing Mrs. Froy, who, spoiler, folks, spoilers, you find out later why she's she works for the British government. She's actually a spy, which is beautiful in itself. She's a governess who's worked with children in Mandrika forever, and it turns out she's actually an undercover spy, this little older lady who, once things get revealed, she's a badass. She's like,
yeah, and it's at the end of in sort of the climax, she makes a run for it through the woods. The train has been stopped. There's all these vaguely European bad guys having a shootout into the train, which we'll talk about that more in a minute. But Mrs. Froy, she gets out, takes her case and runs through the woods, but she gets like shot down. But it's kind of vague as to whether she was actually shot or just winged, or if she knew exactly when to take the fall. Because when she shows up at the very end of the movie, playing the piano with the tune that, broke the code or whatever, it's such a warm, it's almost like the warm feeling you get at the end of It's a Wonderful Life when fucking Clarence gets his wings. Because right before that, Gilbert and Iris, they finally decide to get together, and you're like, yay! And then Gilbert's like, I forgot the tune I'm supposed to deliver to the authorities to stop World War II at that point.
Yeah. Yes, Miss Henderson kissed him so well he forgot the
Well, it's just, he's, he got the girl that he's in love with, and they're in love, and that's great. But oh shoot, the world's gonna end, and then you hear the piano. I'm like, oh my god, this is great.
Yeah, you hear the piano, you're like, oh, did Mrs. Froy make it? I mean, this is a 1938 film, and you're just sitting there going, did Mrs. Froy, is that actually Mrs. Froy? And oh my god, it is, yes.
Dude, it's Chappie showing up at the end of Iron Eagle.
It is. And like I said, you still get all those signature things with the Hitchcock in here. My wife was getting a kick out of it because Mrs. Froy, the gimmick is when her and Iris go initially to get her tea in the diner car, she's trying to tell Iris her name. And she's like, what? Because the whistle keeps blowing and it's really noisy and that. So that's where she writes her name, Froy, in the steam in the window. Like a kid when you draw the face and you tell your kids, don't draw a face. And then, it gets foggy again and the face shows up again. Like months later, you're like, see, this is why I didn't want you to do it, because the finger. So Froy is there. And we even here get the classic Alfred Hitchcock suspense building of the audience knows the bomb is underneath. This isn't a bomb, but the bomb's underneath the table. If the characters don't know, in this case, it's Froy. Iris, again, played wonderfully by Lockwood. She's just selling this that you just feel for her, that nobody believes her, that Mrs. Froy is real. And so they sit by the table where Freud's name is literally written in the mist. And I'm sitting there, like I said, my wife's laughing. I'm going, right there, just look at the window. It says Freud. Look at the window.
And they didn't have to do that. I mean, they could have, like you said, have it be revealed later on in that
Right.
scene, but it is something that we're looking at, hoping that they'll notice, wondering why don't you notice that? But they're so into their own drama and problems that they're not aware of what's written on the window. Yeah, it's very effective. I also love that, the theme of there being an actual stage magician on board the train. There, Iris and Gilbert go looking for clues, and they go into the equipment car or whatever, and they find that this mysterious Italian guy that they'd run into earlier was actually a world-renowned magician. They see the poster of him. They find his disappearing cabinet, and eventually the magician finds them, and there's like this big fight, and it's just so great to see how they use these like magic props on each other, and the whole like knuckle biting when there's like a knife. Like Iris, it's suspense and comedy perfectly combined. Gilbert and this magician guy are in a life and death struggle with the knife. Iris she's kind of petite, so she has to find a chair, bring it, set it up right behind where the guys are struggling, climb up on the chair, and then bite the guy's knuckle. I'm like, what is this movie?
And I love that because, you I think, sometimes we forget how much is choreographed in films, when you watch fight scenes. This felt like such a natural fight for most part. The way this is not a clean, like really well choreographed. I mean, it's played off to feel fairly realistic brawl. I mean, these two guys are defending themselves. They're not exactly the best fighters, but they're fighting the best. And like you said, yeah, she's trying to get it on it. She's just she is not she's not built for a brawl with these two bigger guys, but she's and yeah, they even work a little humor in there and yet suspense because he manages to escape when they think they have him. Because
And
he
this
because he has a piece of evidence that actually proves she's not crazy.
Right, and what they shove his body into it's the glasses, her
Right.
glasses, right? But they shove the magician's body when he's out cold into this trunk, and they tie it with a rope. But it turns out the trunk has a false back, so he escapes. What I loved is that, have you ever seen the Hitchcock movie Rope?
Yeah, that was one of
Yeah.
our 8 weeks of Hitchcock, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I was not
No,
tuned
you were
in.
you that it was before it was BI before Ian, so there you go.
But but no, what it's weird
Mhm,
because I was talking about how much I didn't appreciate, Hitchcock trying to do comedy. I
mhm,
forgot how funny Rope is. Like, there are some great visual gags. It's more of a straightforward kind of suspense
mhm.
drama, but there is some cheekiness to it. And yeah, when they're sitting on that chest with, tied with the rope, I'm like, this I know this movie came out, like a decade or more
Yeah.
before Rope. It almost felt like a reverse callback, like, oh, this is gonna be important later, kids. You just watch.
He works it in later, yeah.
There's gonna be a whole thing with a dead body and a trunk and a rope, and you're gonna love it.
Yeah, so I mean, we've covered our main characters here, and it's wonderful. But what also makes this charming, this film, are your the cast of characters you do run into. I mean, the parallels to Murder on the Orient Express are very prevalent here. You could tell what influence Agatha Christie had on writers after that book came out, and after you could see it in this. There is a heavy influence because it's based on a story, so it's not a whole book. I think it's just a story. But with our side characters, we get this doctor who shows up on the train, Dr. Egon Hartz, not Spengler, Hartz, um, who is a brain surgeon, and he ends up featuring quite prevalent in the story later on as spoilers. You come to find out he's one of the main bad guys orchestrating this whole thing of trying to get Mrs. Froy off the train as a patient of his, covered up in bandages and that because of head surgery, so that they could go kill her once they get to London. And yeah, he's a fun character too, played by Paul Lucas. German accent, but not German accent. Again, they're trying. They're trying really hard to not specify anybody except British and English. That, but as far as bad guys though, they keep it vague. What country it is, they keep it fictional.
Yeah, the one bit I gotta call bullshit on, it's almost like the
Yeah.
cheating magician,
Mhm.
is they do this whole like idea of the body swap. Like uh, at one point, the people on the train say, "Oh, Iris, we did find that little old lady that you were talking about, and it's this person was wearing everything that uh, Miss Froy was wearing, but it's not
Mhm.
her. It's a
Right.
slightly younger little old lady." And later we come to find out the real Mrs. Froy, who was on the train when they did the switch, she was now in the car with the doctor and a nun who was actually working with the doctor to carry out this nefarious plot. And the person under the bandages was supposed to be Miss Froy. Yet, if you look at any of the establishing scenes with that body, like,
Yeah,
no, that's like
that's
that's like a skinny little guy. That's not the frumpy,
yeah.
Mrs. Freud. Not even close. Like it only works when you do the close up and they're like uncovering the bandages. Like, oh, yep, there's her plump, adorable face, and suddenly her body changed. What?
You know, well,
They should have just like bulked her up like with a bunch of blankets or something over the
yeah,
body,
they
but
should have,
no.
yeah. It was a little bit like, "Oh, that was her under there? Okay, that's fine." I love how they call out the nun who was, played by Catherine Lacey, who ends up having a very long career as well, but it's great how they call out the nun because, Iris notices the nun wearing heels.
Which is great because I don't think the way that the Hitchcock establishes this
Mhm.
is they peek in on the car or the compartment.
Yeah,
They see the body in bandages, the nun in the corner, and then the doctor. And they just, Iris
yeah,
and Gilbert kind of look in and then they leave. They come back out, and in the hallway, she's like, I don't think nuns wear high heels. When they peek back in, it's only then that we see
we
that the nun
see.
was wearing. It's not like the Freud thing where it's like there in plain sight for us to
Right.
see. It's a detail that we missed it because Gilbert missed it, and they have to go back and double check. Like, this is what she saw. Great stuff.
It's it's really the movie turns into being told y you're almost being told from Gilbert's perspective rather than Iris, where you start off, you're introduced to Iris and she meets Gilbert and that. When you get to the train stuff, you're with Gilbert. The audience is actually with Gilbert in this. You want to help Iris. The audience wants to help Iris. She's being gaslit. There's all these. So you're with Gilbert. Like you don't know everything, but you're not Iris as far as the confusion goes. You're with Gilbert wanting to help Iris because Iris is in trouble.
Right, and also wondering up till almost the very end of the movie what the significance of Miss Froy
Freud
is,
is, yeah.
because you got all these people coming after her and stuff. And again, this is one of the reasons I give this the advantage over something like a Poirot story, or at
Mhm,
least in the context of Murder on the Orient Express, is you don't have it's almost impossible to figure out how all the pieces fit together, and there's
mhm.
no one standing up and saying, "Oh, it was because of this and this and this and this." Like, it's just the story gets more complex throughout, but you keep getting dribbles of answers to these questions that you have,
Mhm,
and it all kind of washes out in the end. But it was a very simple plot that becomes more convoluted, but it's not like there was a million different pieces, moving at the same time. I, at one point, probably because we talked about murder last week, I thought, oh, everybody on the train really is on the conspiracy. But then in the third act, you realize, no, they're not. And they're on a train that's being diverted into not really Nazi territory. And so they'll have to team up into the wackiest shootout ever. Like, okay, the two guys we mentioned earlier, they're trying to get to London for the cricket match or whatever.
Charters and Caldecott. Yeah.
Right. One of them, like when they're shooting, out, they've got a couple of guns among them, and they're shooting out at these, vaguely German soldiers in the woods. The one guy is on the floor, and he just says, "Nasty jam, this." I'm like, yeah, it is. This is a nasty jam. What the? Like, they're being proper, like, to the very end.
To
Like,
the very end.
the one guy who's like Harry from Night of the Living Dead, the
Yeah.
jerk lawyer guy.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm getting off this train. Damn you all. And they're not going to shoot me. They'd have to arrest me and put me on trial at the very least. He gets off waving a white handkerchief, shot instantly. And even as he collapses onto the ground, he's like, he just falls over.
He falls over dead. Oh, it's beautiful. How they bring these folks together. And it's interesting because up until that point with the conspiracy thing, they establish a lot of these characters have their own motivation for not helping her, but it's not the motivation that they're working with the crooked, not Nazi doctor. They have their own. The lawyer and the woman who are having an affair don't want to actually get involved with Iris's conspiracy because they don't want to be answering questions of why they're there, because they're both still married, trying to figure out how they're going to do a clean divorce from both their significant others. So their motivation for not helping, and for even lying at some points, going, no, I don't remember an old woman, around, is solely because they don't want to be involved. Same theme, just slightly different motivation with our Caldecott and Charters. They're proper English. They know if they get involved, there's going to be delay in the train, and they want to make their cricket match. So they don't admit there was a Mrs. Froy, not necessarily because they're in on whatever conspiracy, but they've got their own selfish reasons.
And that's one of the things that I don't think I've seen this done before. It's a non-conspiracy conspiracy fueled purely by self-interest.
Right.
Like, I mean, this story would have been over like an hour earlier if everyone had just confessed, like, yeah, we saw her.
Yeah,
Where is she?
sure.
We got to figure this out.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's also one of those things where, because the story gets so involved and so zany towards the end, much like I'd forgotten that Iris was engaged. What are these guys, Charters and Caldecott?
Yeah.
I'd forgotten all about the cricket match thing until they get off the train station. They're so happy that they made it in time, and they see the guy with the billboard like passing out the newspapers, like, game called on account of flooding.
Yeah. So yeah, even at the end, they work back around a bit of the humor with these two guys. And it's even funny when they later find Mrs. Froy. They're like, oh, look, there's Mrs. Froy. Oh, I guess she did find her. They just play it off.
Yeah, it's all just, we're just gonna have a happy ending. Deal with
it. But yeah, I loved those two characters as well. But yeah, you get all these kind of what we would recognize later on for many years after this comes out, your kind of tropish characters, but this does not play out, and they aren't exactly in the roles that you might expect going into this film. When you first meet them, you're like, oh, we're going to meet all these characters. They're all in on some kind of thing. No, they're just people that don't want to get involved.
Right, which, I mean, honestly, I think you could remake this movie somehow today. Maybe even keep it a period piece, because I feel like unless they do, there's no cell service through these mountains, like,
Yeah.
But yeah, just talking to the self-involvement and not wanting to get involved in other people's, not really get involved in other people's drama unless it's like on Twitter or Facebook. Yeah, this is, again, it has a very kind of contemporary feel to it. I was totally floored by this movie.
Yeah, it ages well. I mean, and I think that's what actually helps with them not specifying Nazis, not specifying World War II and get involved. Even Caldecott and Charters allude to it, saying, there's been a delay because of some kind of conflict going on, but they won't say what's going on in the rest of Europe or whatnot that's causing problems. They skirt around things very well, but I think it actually helps this film not necessarily date it. Yes, it's black and white and the styles in that, but as far as the story goes, it still works today really well, and it doesn't necessarily attach itself to a specific period in time. It is its own bubble, basically.
Speaking of bubbles, did you see Hitchcock's cameo at the end of the movie?
Oh no, I missed it. Did he have he had it?
Yeah, he did. It's weird because this is like, 20 years before Psycho. So
Yeah.
I was always used to seeing Alfred Hitchcock as like the portly old guy with like the kind of the white thinning hair.
Yeah, yeah.
In this one, he's got like jet black hair. And I swear to God, he's bigger than he was ever in his entire life. It's at the train station where everyone's kind of getting off and there's like a
Yeah.
crowd scene. You see him walk into frame, like pick up a suitcase or something, and just like he does this weird, like almost as he's out of the frame, he does this weird like shuffle with his shoulders. I'm like, what?
Oh,
There's
now
no
see,
context at all.
I'll have to watch this again to check that out.
I rewound like that scene like 4 times. First of all, because I'm like, is that fucking Alfred Hitchcock? And then it was like, wow, he looks different. Like, did he do something with his shoulders? No, he didn't. Yes, he did. Why?
Oh. Yeah, and that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to do this film was go back and, a friend of the spoiler room, Will Johnson, he is going through uh Alfred Hitchcock back catalog as well of things, his
Mm.
blind spots as well, because everybody knows him for, the horror stuff, the suspense stuff. But he's got a huge filmography actually. And you watch this and you see the inklings of what later on would be the signature Hitchcock stuff, but it's just a quirky, quaint, adorable film that you're just like, wait, Hitchcock directed this?
And I may have said this earlier, but I kind of know why more movies like this haven't been made because
Yeah.
I think it takes a specific sensibility that Hitchcock had to make
Mhm.
this perfect blend of comedy, suspense, and adventure. It's not too jokey, it's not too serious or violent or dark, it's not heavy-handed, but it's just, yeah, everything. It's delightful is the only. I hate that word because a lot of people use it to describe things nowadays, but
Yeah.
this movie is delightful to watch.
It is. It's quirky and it's delightful. I mean, because there's even the doctor guy there until the very end when he shows up in the not Nazi outfit with the not Nazi German cars and the not Nazi soldiers. Um, Up until that point, even him, all the characters are interesting, but they're none of them are ones like, oh man, I just hate that guy. There's no real characters that you just initially off the bat hate. Uh, at all. You might think they're a little stuffy like Caldecott and Charters, uh, but at the same time, there's not a character in here where you're just like, God, I just hated that one character. They all have some charm to them.
They do, and Caldecott and Charters, especially because you think they can't just be two schlubs who are trying to get to a frickin'
Cricket match, yeah.
sports, yeah, cricket match. That's got to be the cover. They're part of something nefarious. Like, no, they're just two guys who really like their sports,
You know,
and they'll literally do anything to not be late for that match.
and with it being 38, they're ex-soldiers because they probably served in some form early on, when they were younger, because they're older gentlemen. So they most likely served in World War I or near the tail end of some kind. Because when we get to the, like you said, the climax, there is a shootout, and Charters is really accurate with his gunfire. Actually, he takes out a couple guys, and they have no hesitation in grabbing the gun and starting to shoot people.
Oh yeah, because at one point he says, one of them he says they're yelling out into the woods where they've got they're kind of surrounded. And he says, look, if you take one more, any of you take one more step, and I'm going to start shooting. And so they start advancing. It's like, boom, he takes
Boom.
out the fourth guy on the left. Like,
Got a
there's
guy.
none of this like, no. And
No.
that opens up. It's like the Wild Bunch. It just kicks everything off.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, even you've got some tension, but not too heavy. And that's what's weird. And it even that shows the skill of Hitchcock, that not just the master of suspense, he's able to juggle this film to where it could easily get too heavy, but it never, even at the parts where it's revealed, or the darkness, or what they want to do to Mrs. Froy or whatnot, it never gets too heavy. I mean, it gets, it never gets like, whew, you know?
Well, even more than that, like it has like a false climax because
Mhm.
I mean, I would watch this on, HBO Max,
Yeah.
and it's an hour and 42 minutes
About that, yeah.
or what, 36, I don't know. But I was like looking at the time counter. So like it feels like the story is just like winding down, and like, okay, they've got like 15 minutes left in this. I also forgot that this was an older film, so all the end credits are in the beginning.
Yeah,
So you can't
right?
even do that. You can't even do that math of like, oh, it's 15 minutes left. That really means 10. But no, like once they get to the train station and they think they're safe because Mrs. Froy's going to get off the train and get to where she's going, that's when they unhitch the train and they send it down an alternate path right into the heart of enemy territory for this big
Mhm.
setup. That's when like the real action, this movie takes an entirely different turn, becomes something else that's like crazy exciting in a way that the first, 2/3 of the movie are
Mhm.
great, but they weren't like the way things
Mhm.
end up, as totally unexpected. Just when you think you can sigh relief and like, oh, this is almost over, it kicks into like really high gear. It's so exciting.
It does, and you get this point to where the nun is now helping them, where she was helping the doctor, she's now helping them, including hitting the switch track so that they could get the train away, you know?
And she gets, yeah, and she's climbing back onto the train. She gets shot.
But she
Um,
doesn't die, she just
right.
gets shot in the leg. I love how they establish that. You're like, "Oh," when she gets shot, she's like, "Oh, it's just my leg," and I'm like, "Well, she's kinda hardcore too." She's like, "Yeah, it just was shot in my leg." Like,
Well, I
damn.
mean, let's give some points to Gilbert because at one point when he wants to prove that it's Mrs. Froy under all those bandages, he climbs out the train window and cleverly, I've not seen this before. He lowers the smaller windows in
Yeah.
order to create like handles for him to like make his way across the train car. I'm like, that's dangerous and clever at the same time.
Clever. And they even do this wonderful thing where they've got the stock footage of trains, on a screen or whatnot. Obviously, he's not on a real train, but he's
Oh, that's
hanging,
right.
and the other train is coming this way, and he has to, he almost falls off.
But it's perfectly lined up.
Yeah.
Because even though it's totally fake, it looks, the illusion is such that it looks like he narrowly avoided getting hit by the train.
Which, when I see scenes like that, I'm thinking back to 1938, and I'm like, I could see audiences like really like one of those where the whole audience goes, "Oh," type of
Right.
deal.
Because it's not in the, well, it gets back to the whole like film versus high def, but I can
Right.
imagine that you can't see all the seams necessarily like you
Mhm.
can see on Blu-ray. It's going to look more quote unquote realistic.
Right, on
But
a
yeah,
screen with the grain and that, but I mean, it's actually a very, harrowing type of scene. You're just like, even now watching it, it's like, I know that's just a rear projection, but it's still actually kind of an intense scene. You don't want him to fall off, but, again, magic of Hitchcock. Um, just to bring it around a bit, eh, pardon my plug, but I happen to be a guest on the, Literary License podcast recently, and the host of it is in Britain, Keith Achago, and I hope I pronounced that right. Anyway, he mentioned, because I mentioned that we're covering The Lady Vanishes this week, and he goes, "Oh yeah," he's like, "That's a really popular film over here." He goes, "We watch it every year at Christmas," and I'm like, "What?" Because I had barely even heard of this film, but apparently it's a big deal. It's one of those classic, like, over here, like the whole It's a Wonderful Life, but apparently it's on TV every year around Christmas. The Lady Vanishes shows on TV in that.
You know, I kind of want to make that a tradition in my house. Because it feels like a movie. You put on some hot cocoa and a big comforter, and you just watch it
Right.
with your family. Because yeah, I can totally see that.
Because again, for the subject matter and everything going on, it never gets too heavy. It gets to the edge at a few points, but it never gets that heavy. It never gets that like, oh, you know, it's literally a, for lack of a better term, a quaint film. It is just quirky, fun, interesting film that has a wonderful spirit to it that you might not equate with the director who's directing it.
And I'm going to say it again because I said at the top of the show, Margaret Lockwood was 22 when she made this movie.
And
I still can't get over it.
I can't either because she's got such a screen presence in this through this entire film because it rests pretty much on her shoulders along with Redgrave, but especially her. She's got to sell this and she does it so well. I mean, she really is the linchpin for this film and it's like wow, she's a strong character who has, and I'm doing this because of in context of what we're maybe used to seeing some other female characters of the time written. She's got her wits about her. She's got, she is not a bubbly headed young woman. She is a woman of the world who has experienced a lot of things. And you get that feeling. You don't get the feeling like, she's putting on an act. She's genuine, strong person who's very much adamant about the fact she saw Mrs. Freud.
And I know we're wrapping up here, but
Mhm,
the more I watch older films,
mhm.
the more I'm wondering where the hell this cliche of the not empowered strong woman comes from. Because I'm seeing more examples of women who are quote
It
unquote ahead of their time than I am whatever this mythical, like, oh, she's so helpless, she needs a man to rescue her
it
example is. It feels more like a popular myth that was designed to help bring
No, it
about a solution than it does an actual like stereotype.
it rears its head, I think, where it spawns from, well, especially from the 50s, but I think where it rears its head is because what we're watching, because when it came from the 50s too, you had the various gambit of female characters from strong to kind of more what people expect, say is the more cliche, not so strong female character in the 50s. It is the 50s where it's changed, but genre films, they're still more prevalent than say your standard straight film, and where you have your strong female character. And I think that's where that kind of comes from. The popular mainstream like dramas and that the way female characters were written. But the genre films, I think, have overall a history of having stronger female characters than, because in this one, it's not even it's not the guy to the rescue. They're kind of they're co-workers in
Oh
this
yeah, it's a
mystery.
team
It's
effort. They need each other.
right. They need each other. It's not like he's like takes the reins and goes, "Oh no, Mrs. Froy is here," or whatnot. You never feel like he takes command, but at the same, you feel like they're on equal level. And I think it really does change around the 50s, which a lot of things changed around in the 50s. The more conservative movement, a lot of things got pushed in the 50s. And I think where that's maybe where kind of that comes from.
Well,
Um,
I'll have to take your word for that because I've seen some movies from the 50s,
mhm,
certainly not perhaps as many as I should. But even then, I'm trying to think of where this came from. And
mhm,
I'm wondering if it very well might be that we just had this very weird decade of the 1950s because the stuff that came before it and the stuff that came after it, it
mhm.
just seemed like there was a blip that people caught on to. I'm like, we need to see more empowered female characters. I'm like, look at maybe any decade except the 1950s, and
Well, I
you'll
mean,
have dozens.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Lady Vanishes. We've got not only Iris, who's strong, you've got Mrs. Froy, who is just badass grandma. Badass governess. Um, you've got the other female characters. You've got the nun who ends up standing up to the doctor and ends up, playing a part as well. And she's got bravery and strength to her. You've got the old madam in there who reminds me a lot from the or Murder on the Orient Express. you know,
Right. And she's like in league with the pseudo Nazis, in sort of like a command role. You can see her out in the woods at the car.
yeah,
You've
the
even got
Baroness, yeah.
right, and you've even got quote unquote Mrs. Todd Hunter, who's the second half of the affair couple. At one point, when her husband is losing his mind, he's like, "We got to get out of here. We can't stay here. This is stupid." And she's like, "If you go out there, they're going to shoot you." And he's like, "But no, they won't." But
And she's
then
like,
at what she says, stop your gibberish, Eric. Nobody's listening to you."
well, and she even's the one that she decided that she would say that she does remember Mrs. Froy because she does. And it's only until he tries to make an argument going, yeah, this is going to ruin both our lives if we have to go into questioning, that she changes her mind a bit, reluctantly. But even she's overall a stronger female character. It's really interesting. There's a lot of equals. All the characters are equal on this film. I think that's what's also the charm, is you watch this and you never feel like any one character is above the rest. They're all on kind of equal ground here, taking on the pseudo Nazis
Yeah.
at the end. So yeah, this is I'm gonna watch it again. I know at some point. It is a wonder. This is a one. I'm glad I picked this film because this is a wonderful film. This is just a wonderful, fun watch. Really.
Yeah, and it even I mean, I was not a fan of Murder on the Orient
Mhm.
Express, but I'm glad we watched that movie and talked about it before we watched this movie.
Sure.
Because I feel like if we'd started off with this and then gone to Murder, I would have had less patience for it even then. Because this is like the pinnacle of this kind of story. I mean, at least for me. I'm so glad you recommended this because honestly, yeah, this is in the pantheon of favorite films for me. Something I just watched today.
Yeah, me as well. It's become one of my favorite Hitchcock films, which again, Psycho is one of my all-time favorite films of all time, and especially all-time favorite horror films. But this one, I'm like watching it because with it being his earlier work, you could see him handling it with even lighter material. You can see those Hitchcockian nuances and styles that he would refine over the next years, till when he gets good old Norman and his mommy issues, so yeah, folks, check out The Lady Vanishes. Don't let the black and white fool you. It moves for a film of this type as well. It keeps its pace fairly well, its energy, even when you get into the quieter spots. And that's all part of that talent of not everybody, not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera, producer and director. And yeah, it's just a fun movie. It really is.
Yeah, and you can see it. It's on HBO Max. It might even
Mhm.
be on the Criterion
It's on
channel. I don't know.
Freevee. It's on
Is it on
Freevee.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I watched it on Freevee. So unfortunately, there were commercials in between. There were a couple commercial breaks where it's like, God,
Yeah.
God dang. But but outside of the commercial breaks, it's on Freevee as well. So it's out there.
Yeah, and if you watch it and you love it, like I mentioned, at least right now, it's like half off on Amazon through
Good.
Criterion.
I might
Yeah.
have to check that out because yeah, it's just got a great cast and it's fun, and you can see why this film launched a lot of careers because there's a lot of people in this who would go on later, and they pretty much. I was looking up even the smaller cast. A lot of these folks went on to have extensive careers after this movie. This movie became a big hit. Um, and not just Redgrave, but Catherine Lacey and everybody. Basil Rathford, who plays Charters, he and a few other stars of this would end up going again with Redgrave in a movie called Dead of Night, which I may have to cover this year because there are a lot of people in that film as well that I've not heard of, but it looked interesting with the cast they had. But
I'm there for it.
so,
Whatever you put together, I will support it heartily.
wait till you say that now. Wait till you see snakes on a train. But then, like, I had to throw one in there. Okay, end of the month, we're doing snakes on a train. I apologize ahead of time. I apologize to you, and I apologize to our listeners. But I wanted to do this because it's a film. It's a film that exists from the asylum, and it'll be interesting to see going from these films to that film.
I haven't seen Snakes on a Train, so I don't want to prejudge. I just want to ask anyone out there who's watching this, can you do a supercut or like an edit, a fan edit of Snakes on a Train, inserting Margaret Lockwood and Michael Redgrave into that movie so that they're like fighting the snakes on the train?
They're fighting the snakes.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could work some movie magic with that. So there you have it, folks. Check it out. The Lady Vanishes, 1938 classic Hitchcock, and I can see why this launched him as well with kind of the tough parts that he had at the beginning of his career. You can just see this and see why it took off, why it did. And yeah, it's going to become a regular viewing for me as well. So there you have it, folks. Thank you for listening to us talk about The Lady Vanishes. And now, as always, license to shill to my guest, Mr. Ian Simmons. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Ian Simmons. I run Kicking the Seat, which you can find at kickseat.com and also on YouTube. If you look up Kicking the Seat, I'll be there doing movie reviews and interviews and roundtables and all sorts of fun stuff. And yeah, that's what I do.
So there you have it, folks. The Lady Vanishes is actually an e-ticket from both of us. So definitely a ride you want to take. Now, will that be the same with next week's movie, Snowpiercer, where we're kicking off our 10th anniversary special series, The Perfect 10? So that will be an interesting discussion, I'm sure, as well. So stay tuned for that, folks. Check out Ian's stuff. Like I mentioned, the Literary License podcast I was on, as well as the Horror Countdown podcast, which is a newer podcast you should check out, where I actually did a list. I did a list of 10 horror remakes, and we had a discussion, a wonderful time there. And yeah, check all that out. And thank you for listening. And I would just say a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Or would that be good evening?
Just stick with good night, Mark.
Good night. Dun, 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 dun.